I wish all Rwandans at this time of these terrible memories of what happened to their loved ones, not to lose hope, because to lose hope is actually to die. And the fact that for those who are surviving and those across in Rwanda and elsewhere, it is a testimony that Rwandans have a degree of resilience, and we can count on it, and we can count on each other, because we can heal ourselves by also participating in the healing of others. And I think that is one message I could give at this point in time.
Dear listeners, welcome to this program, this English service of radio television Ishakwe, the voice of Ishakwe Rwanda Freedom Movement, a Rwandan opposition party in exile. Today, we are talking about the 30th anniversary of genocide, Rwanda genocide 30 years after. Today's guest is Dr. Theogene RUDASINGWA. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Sixbert.
Yeah, thank you. Today we are talking about the 30th anniversary of the genocide of Tutsis in Rwanda. Today is an introductory program, and we will talk about the causes of the genocide against the Tutsis, the regime that produced the genocide in 1994, and the context of the war, of course, the war between RPF, Rwanda Patriotic Front, and the then Rwandan government. Dr. Theogene RUDASINGWA, you've been Secretary General of the Rwandan Patriotic Front. You've been the Rwandan ambassador in the United States, Washington, D.C. And now you are the chairman of Ishakwe Rwanda Freedom Movement, our political organization. We are going to talk about the causes of the genocide, but before we reach there, I know that this is a very painful moment for many Rwandans. Personally, when it comes to this period, how do you feel personally as a person? And then I will ask you, how do you feel as a leader?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, Sixbert, for having me. And whenever the month of April begins for most Rwandans, each one of us can recall the time when it all began. It all began, in a sense, I'm not talking about when the troubles of Rwanda began, is much longer. I'm not talking about the last 100 years. I'm sure we've had many times an opportunity to cast our eyes back into our history, but in this sense, one asks yourself, where was I on April 6th? Because we are coming, tomorrow will be April 6th. And we know what followed April 6th: the shooting down of the plane, the genocide that began, the killings that began, and the 100 days that followed. So literally, I will ask you the same question to maybe to tell me where you were on the evening of April 6th. But for me, I was not even in the northern territory of Rwanda, where our headquarters, the RPF headquarters, was. I was in fact in Kampala. I was attending a conference, a Pan-African movement conference in Kampala, and I had gone alongside my colleague, the late Patrick Mazimhaka, and many other colleagues, including Wilson Rutaisire, whom we called Shaban. So we're attending that conference, and that evening, after the events of that evening, I returned to a Ugandan friend's home and I switched on BBC probably around 1 a.m. and that's when I heard about the shooting down of the plane. And remember contemplating that, and the following morning, of course, I headed to Mulindi, where our headquarters was. So that's how I remember. I can always remember. So before we go, I tell you some of the questions that you asked me. I want to ask you also, 6 days, where were you on April 6th, on the evening of April 6th?
Oh, that night, that evening, I was actually in Rwanda, in Kigali. I was in Kacyiru, and curiously, that evening, I went home early. Normally, that time I was working as a journalist, an independent journalist, and we used to work until late. But the climate in Rwanda, and especially in Kigali, the climate has been bad, and militias were holding roadblocks, and in the night, from 6 o'clock, they were starting to put roadblocks all over the capital in Kigali. So it was a good idea to go home early. So I've reached home like half an hour before that, and the plane was shot down. Some people they called. We talked about the incident. We didn't know exactly that it was the presidential plane that was downed. We talked about a terrible explosion in the area of Kanombe. Later on, we knew that it was the presidential plane, and we understood that it was that time. In my small family, that time we said, this is the end. We understood it was the end. And actually, to me, the Rwanda we've known before that day, that Rwanda ended and the new Rwanda started. So I was in Kigali, and I was in Kacyiru, a few kilometers from where the incident happened.
Yeah, and literally every other person who was, even young people, if you asked any one of us Rwandans, they would remember where they were. They are events that cannot escape your memory. And so naturally in the month of April, many Tutsis, those who survived, and many Tutsis who had been refugees outside of Rwanda, generally amongst us, you cannot escape the tragedy that befell hundreds of thousands of Tutsis who perished during that genocide. But we also, it's not uniquely Tutsi in a way, and we shall have in another program, we shall have to talk about the plight and the killings of the Hutus. But Sixbert, you remember there are many Hutu who also perished alongside the Tutsis, and they didn't commit any sin or except that the regime of the day looked at them as enemies or as allies of the Tutsis, and that was the only basis on the basis that they were killed. And so
especially some others were killed because they were just leaders of the opposition parties, because after the news was out that President Habyarimana was killed, his presidential guard rushed to kill many members of the opposition immediately. Because they thought if we let them, they will take over. So the idea was to kill them immediately.
Yeah. So it's a period of a very agonizing period, in which very sorrowful period, because it's a period of remembering To many people, I'm sure the majority of the people who suffered through that whole tragic experience, it's only like yesterday. I cannot even believe that 30 years later, I'm 30 years older, of course, but looking back, it's as if, in my memory, it's as if it was only yesterday. And I'm sure people looking back, they would say the same. And so the question that often human beings ask in such times, when we do remember, we ask, how could it happen? How could it happen? How come that human beings could inflict such human suffering, untold human suffering, on other human beings, when we all claim one language, Ikinyarwanda or Kinyarwanda, when we all claim one nationality, we all proudly say, oh, we are all Rwandese, as it goes. We are all Banyarwanda. And how could it happen when, in fact, we've lived on these same hills? Rwanda is often, called the land of 1,000 hills. And on each of those 1,000 hills, the killings took place. And so you always ask, even for believers, I'm a Christian, you're a Christian, I know Sixbert, we ask, if God is good, how could he actually allow such things to happen? That's a theological question.
No, actually, I thought that people will just say that if God is there, why did he allow? And they stop going to church? Because even people were slaughtered in churches in Rwanda that time. And
yes.
In many churches, people were slaughtered. And then we were wondering, will people go again to church? And curiously, churches are still mushrooming in Rwanda. There was
yes, there
was like 4 or 5 churches at that time, and now probably you have about 500-600 churches.
Because the theological question often asked is, if God is good, and that is what we believers hold, God is good, then how could he allow such thing to happen? But we also that God is too powerful, all powerful. We all say that if he's so powerful, why can he not stop something like that from happening? But we are not now talking about theology and philosophy. It's a very concrete question that we Rwandans ask at such time as this. But we are not the first ones to pose that question. Because before I mentioned about 5 things that normally underlie genocide and which were very much present in Habyarimana's regime, let me say that there have been other genocides. The ones that we remember what happened to the Jews in Germany during the Second World War. We remember the genocide of the Armenians that took place against the Armenian people. We remember Bosnia and Herzegovina. That's fairly recent, almost happening shortly before the genocide of Tutsis in Rwanda in 1994. That happened in the 1990s in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We remember the Cambodian genocide, the country of Cambodia. We also know that genocide occurred in recent times, Darfur in Sudan. Is there any other one you can remind me that I've forgotten in recent times? But now
there's no, I don't remember any other one in recent times.
Yeah, but right now, in recent times, there have been the Rohingya people from Myanmar. That's a country that I always find difficult. Yes. But you can also, in current terms, there is the problem of what is happening in Gaza,
Yes.
in Palestine, but we're not venturing into that because the international community has not yet put its stamp in describing what is going on, because it takes a long time. And for the Armenian genocide, it has taken a long time for people to start recognizing it. And later on, in another program, we shall be talking about genocide against Hutu, to give it a bit of context, but that's not what we are discussing today. Today, we are talking about genocide against Tutsi. So in all those circumstances where genocide has occurred, there are certain things, patterns that you see that underlie a genocide. Number one, there is a genocide. There is an ideology. There's an ideology. There has to be an ideology that simply looks at the other people as not humans, that dehumanizes the other side, that looks at the other side as the other, not as the other that can live, but the other that does not deserve to live. So there is, number one, an ideology. In most cases where genocide has occurred, there is also conflict. And that kind of conflict causes the people who are in power to think, since they are armed with this kind of ideology, in practical terms, they also think that if they could, since there is a conflict, the conflict itself generates the momentum for them to think we can find a final solution. Like the Nazis found a final solution against the Jews, against other groups that they thought were subhuman or certainly not deserving to live, but targeting specifically the Jews. So the context of a war or conflict is often the underlying current that the regime of the day uses to practically engineer that final solution to eliminate the group in whole or in part, as the genocide is described. Number three, within society itself, and this is associated also with the ideology of genocide. Normally within society, there are certain grievances that a certain group has, which becomes the basis of explaining why they should eliminate another group, like a pretext. Those grievances normally are within elite, an elite that is a small group that comes into power and can remind the whole of society or certain members of society that, oh, do you remember how you were treated? How you used to be underdogs? How you used to be treated like subhuman? Now, in the case, of course, Germany or Cambodia or the Rohingya people or all these places that we've mentioned, you can always find some grievance that the small group, which is a minority in power, some kind of idea, the grievance that they come back to point out within society that these people actually need to be eliminated because A, B, C, D. So that can be found within the elite, but it also can be found within the general population. The group in whose name they are trying to either make pure, in the case of Germany, or trying to save, as it has happened, of course, in the case of Rwanda, which we are coming back to. So there is that kind of grievance that you can find amongst the elite that they can point to that in your history there was this inequality in your history, this is how you're treated. And whenever you have an elite that is preaching that, preaching only to a group that may have these grievances indeed, they have such a powerful force. So we shouldn't just look at a government alone. We should also be looking at society. Number 4, there are also external factors which can certainly come to help the group that is organizing and executing a genocide. They come to aid it or to support it in many other ways, just as we've seen in some instances, genocide has been stopped only when external actors have come in to help and stop the genocide. But we shall have that discussion in another program. So there are external elements, external factors that contribute to a genocide. And those are 4 factors. I said 5, but maybe those 4 are enough. But the Sixbert, when you look at if we shed the light on the Habyarimana regime, all these factors that I've mentioned were already there before the invasion of RPF in 1990. But the Hutu regime of President Habyarimana, one can only see it with a bit of a historical perspective, because you would have to go and look at how Rwanda was ruled by Tutsi kings for centuries, and amongst the Hutu, especially amongst the Hutu elite and Hutu population in general, may have that in their thinking, the way they were brought up, but especially the elite. So the ruled by Tutsi kings for many centuries, and the way that many would have said in history that Hutus were not treated as, we know history, we are not going into that. And then the colonial history, the way colonial history came and first looked at the kings and the Tutsi chiefs, as superior people. And I'm sure some Tutsi elite believed that and used it against
even now, when you observe what is going on in Kigali, some
yes.
Tutsis, they believe they are superior humans.
Yes,
They
yes,
believe
yes.
that. Yeah.
And then there came the Hutu Revolution of 1959, and before then, the same Catholic Church and the colonial authorities that were the architect of this unequal status of the population. Because remember, Europeans who colonized Africa were coming from a racist Europe. So they were looking at Rwandans through that prism of European racism, and first said the Tutsis are superior. Then towards, when the anti-colonial movement started, they started switching now to the Hutus, who collaborated with them in order to create the end of the monarchy and the creation of a Hutu republic. And so the 2 republics, Kaibandas and Habyarimanas, were founded on that kind of ideology that somehow had been contributed to largely by the colonial authorities. It's not the colonial authorities that created Tutsis and Hutus and Twas. They found them there. But with time, these identities started having a very political and a very pernicious kind of dimension. And I think it's when we look at the Habyarimana regime, then we have to look at its ideology. Number 2, there was a conflict. The was civil war had started. RPF had invaded Rwanda in 1990. And number three, of course, there was within society, as I've been trying to explain, the whole issue of grievances that can be found within history. And later on, there are external factors, the role of France, the role of Belgium, the role of Zaire, the role of Uganda, the role of, and later on after April 6, the role of the United States and the United Nations, the behavior, all that comes into aiding, either helping the genocide to be executed, in our case, and certainly the shooting down of the plane by the RPF made a huge provided a very powerful trigger to that. But you can look into the behavior of the elite, the behavior of the media, the Rwandan media at that time, the power factions within the political parties. You can see the behavior of the elite. All that, as I've explained, contributed to that tragedy of Rwanda of 1994, in which Tutsis perished and many Hutus perished, and created conditions, of course, for capture of state power and what happened thereafter. But what I wanted to emphasize is that genocide does not happen in a vacuum. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. There has to be an ideology, there has to be an elite, of course, an elite that is, a clique that has captured power. It may even be popular, because there was a time Nazi Germany, Hitler was popular, but that in itself, riding on the wave of popularity, can create the conditions in which a terrible tragedy like genocide can happen. And so these are some of the conditions I can say always, if people are not careful, can easily be repeated, because we say, let us not repeat history. Let us, you make it never again, genocide. I'm sure on Sunday, that's what Kagame and the company will be saying. But I look back, I look at the sacrifices that the Rwandans made, Tutsis within RPF, the Tutsis who perished in that war, but also looking at the survivors of genocide, looking at how many people perished at that time. So you look back, sometimes you ask yourself, what did we achieve? Did we really achieve never again? But today we are not venturing into that territory. We shall be having another program, maybe much later in the month of April, to ask ourselves, where are we right now? Have we really decisively said never again, so that something of that magnitude, of that tragedy, of that magnitude will never happen? Can we say that it will never happen again? We shall be looking at the conditions that existed during the
period
regime, the period, and
the
ask
period that
ourselves,
led to the genocide, yes.
Yes, and see whether they have ended, and we're now on a pathway of really saying never again, without using it as a slogan, a convenient slogan to justify the regime of the day. So those are some of the conditions I can see.
That's a very important analysis to see, actually, to look back and to look at the victims, and to look at that slogan, that never again slogan, and how far Rwandans have gone to reach that goal, that never again. I think this, the way you analyze this, the conditions that led to the genocide, it's very clear that all the ingredients were there for trouble. All the ingredients were there. Today we are, this is part one of or an introduction program, and we'll talk more about the genocide, the Rwandan genocide that happened in 1994, hopefully in 3 or 4 parts, analyzing actually the regime that was there, the Habyarimana regime that led to the genocide, and the role of foreign powers. You mentioned Belgium, France, United States of America, and the conditions that allowed such a genocide against the Tutsis to happen. And again, we revisit this never again slogan. But today, I would like to ask you to send a message or to say something about the genocide. I mean, to send a message to the victims and to the Rwandans. Dr. Theogene RUDASINGWA.
Yes, in reflecting on this whole question of Tutsi genocide, because I'm Tutsi, so naturally it's understandable that it affects me as it affects every other Tutsi. I lost so many people, relatives who I was looking forward, because remember I grew up in refugee camps in the neighboring countries of East Africa, in Burundi, in Tanzania, in Kenya, in Uganda. And in going back, there was a bit of excitement as we invaded Rwanda in 1990. It was not only going back to the country that I had heard from my mother, I was also looking forward to seeing many of my relatives who had remained in Rwanda, who my mother used to talk about, who are still living. In fact, during that period after we became refugees, I think my mother had 2 occasions in which she was able to visit Rwanda, but I had never stepped in Rwanda. So I looked forward to seeing many of my relatives. And of course, like many other Tutsis, they perished, and I never saw them. In fact, many of I'm sure Sixbert, I come from Chibungo, I was told. But if did you ever visit the site, the genocide site of Nyarubuye?
Yes, I've been there.
Yes. Many of my relatives are, I'm sure, among those that perished in Nyarubuye and across Rwanda, of course. So for such times as these, for people who have survived, what can I say except to say that it's important to keep on hoping to and being able to participate in a process of coping, because if you've lost your loved ones, even people who die from natural causes, if you've lost somebody, of course you never forget. Nothing, absolutely nothing can ever make you forget your loved ones. But it's important to know that surviving means that you have to equip yourself to know how to cope with, not totally overcome, but to cope with your trauma. Because in one of the programs much later, I'll be talking about healing and overcoming or coping with intergenerational trauma, because Rwanda has gone through every period that we've gone through that has been characterized with major political changes. It has been producing trauma. Even before one episode ends, you're subjected to another trauma. So imagine what Rwandans went through in 1959, and then in 1973, and then 1994, and up to now, we keep on piling trauma upon trauma. So I invite my fellow Rwandans not to lose hope, but always to have hope in reaching out to our fellow Rwandans. Because remember, the Tutsi genocide was not committed by foreigners. Foreigners may aid us in inflicting trauma on our fellow Rwandans, but genocide in Rwanda, genocide against Tutsi was committed
by Rwandans.
Yes. And later on, when we talk about also how the other side suffered, because every genocide has victims and has perpetrators. Never mind that in different historical periods, we keep on changing positions. The victims of today can easily become the perpetrators of tomorrow. And so goes on the cycle of inflicting damage on each other. And so the process of healing, which is one point I want to emphasize today, begins with you and me. Don't look to government, don't look to... There are so many things that can help you or make your situation worse, but we belong to families, we belong to a community, sometimes we belong to a church, we belong to a nation. All those entities that we belong to, communities we belong to, can help us, but nothing can replace you and me as the individual at the heart of the healing process. And often, by helping myself to heal myself, and you can only do that by reaching out to others, it's a process in which both of us can be healed. And I think the late Bishop Desmond Tutu said it more eloquently. He said, he was a Christian, of course, but he evoked the African philosophy of Ubuntu. Ubuntu, in our language, it's really being a human being, discovering your own well-being and being a human being in the other. When you see Sixbert, I see myself. When Sixbert sees me, he sees himself. If you shed all these other things that we call ourselves, Abahutu, Abatutsi, Abatwa, I've heard from you people even talking about that people from Kivu have their own way of thinking, or people from Gikongoro have their own way of thinking, that Abanyenduga have a way of thinking, they have a way of thinking. Well, for me, the baseline is, the starting point is that we all share one thing. We're human beings with the same blood, and we are so lucky we also share being Rwandans and being Africans. But even if you had to take away all that, at the core, we are human beings. And so discovering ourselves in each other helps in that process of healing. And so I can see that this is a very difficult subject to be talking about healing, especially with very fresh and very tragic memories. But the fact that we've survived, Rwandans have survived this long, is testimony to their resilience. Not that they have healed completely, it's not a cure. Even when you go to hospital and they tell you you have cancer or you have diabetes, often it's the condition that you can live for a long time with. Others, like cancer, you know that they'll tell you maybe you may not live for more than 5 years or 10 years. But still, even if you do not get a cure for a condition, you can be engaged in a process of healing. So I wish all Rwandans, at this time of these terrible memories of what happened to their loved ones, not to lose hope, because to lose hope is actually to die. And the fact that for those who are surviving and those across in Rwanda and elsewhere, it is a testimony that we have, Rwandans have a degree of resilience, and we can count on it, and we can count on each other, because we can heal ourselves by also participating in the healing of others. And I think that is one message I could give at this point in time.
Yeah, thank you so much indeed, Dr. Theogene RUDASINGWA, for your powerful words. And we'll be talking more about the Rwandan genocide in our new programs during at least this month of April. And we will continue the series of programs we've started before, but that will be definitely after this month of April. I thank everybody who has been following this program, and we continue next week. Thank you so much indeed, and see you next week.
Thank you.